The rain came quietly that night, not in violent sheets, but in soft, persistent drops that tapped against the windows of the Red Cedar County Emergency Dispatch Center. It was the kind of rain that felt eternal, as if it had been falling for years, soaking into the very bones of the small Wisconsin town of Miller's Creek. Outside, the streets were empty, washed clean of life. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above a row of desks cluttered with radios, headsets, and the stale smell of burnt coffee. Jenna Morales sat at her station, her eyes half-lidded, one hand wrapped around a chipped mug. She had worked the night shift long enough to know its rhythms, the low hum of machines, the occasional call about a loose dog or a fender bender, the way time itself seemed to stretch and bend between the hours of 10 and dawn. At 10:13 p.m., the clock blinked in red digits as if to remind her that the world beyond these walls was still moving. The first call of the evening had been a domestic dispute that ended before officers arrived. The second, a report of a missing goat, quickly resolved when the animal wandered home. Miller's Creek was that kind of place. Most nights, Jenna felt more like a listener than a lifesaver, her job a thread holding together the small worries of small lives. And then the line rang again. The sound was sharp, almost jarring in its suddenness. Jenna straightened, setting down her mug. She pressed the button and lifted her headset, ready for another routine call. 911, what's your emergency? Her voice was calm, practiced. At first, there was nothing. Only static, a low hiss like wind moving through wires. Jenna frowned, tapping the volume dial. "Hello," she prompted gently. "This is 911. Can you hear me?" A sound emerged. Not words at first, but breathing, thin, shaky, almost swallowed by the static. Jenna's pulse ticked up a notch. "Are you safe? Can you tell me where you are?" And then, just above the noise, a voice. Small, fragile, a child's whisper, "Help me!" The hairs on Jenna's arms lifted. The voice was not panicked or sobbing. It was far worse than that, calm, deliberate, as though every syllable had been stolen from the dark. Dad put new locks. The words were broken, interrupted by a crackle of interference. "Sweetheart, what's your name? Can you tell me where you are?" Jenna's voice stayed level, though her heart hammered. She leaned forward, pressing the headset tight against her ear. There was a shuffle, a stutter of breath. Then the whisper came again, even fainter. He says, "We need to be better," a pause heavy with fear. Said, "The basement." Static swelled and swallowed the line whole. No, stay with me," Jenna urged. "Don't hang up. We're sending someone right now. Just keep talking to me." But the line went dead with a soft final click. Jenna sat frozen for a beat, her hand still hovering over the keyboard. Then training kicked in. She traced the call immediately, expecting a cell phone signal, maybe a landline. What appeared on her screen instead made her stomach twist. A payphone. An old one that hadn't been used in years, sitting beside a derelict gas station off Highway 41. She dispatched the nearest patrol unit, giving them every detail she had. Even as she spoke, dread pooled low in her chest. The voice had been so quiet, so certain. This was not a prank. She knew it deep in her bones. 15 minutes later, the report came back. Nothing. No child, no footprints, no dropped belongings. The payphone was still there, rusted and silent, but the night held its secrets tight. The officers swept the surrounding woods and the skeletal remains of the gas station, their flashlights cutting pale tunnels through the rain. There was no sign that anyone had been there at all. The report was filed as unconfirmed distress call, a probable hoax, they said. Jenna did not believe it for a second. When her shift ended at dawn, she made a copy of the call and slid the USB drive into her pocket. She labeled the file simply Unresolved 0515. As she drove home through the misty morning, the voice echoed in her head. "Help me. Dad put new locks. The town would wake soon. Farmers would rise before the sun, coffee would brew, and church bells would ring over red barns and white fences. Miller's Creek would look like a painting again, every brushstroke neat and unassuming. But Jenna would carry that whisper like a splinter under her skin. Years before that night, long before Jenna ever sat in her dispatch chair, the Whitlock family had been celebrated. Daniel and Ruth Whitlock owned a thriving dairy farm on the edge of town. Their land stretched wide and green, dotted with cows, and framed by the kind of white picket fences that belonged on postcards. Daniel was broad-shouldered and tireless, known for rising before dawn and working until the stars came out. Ruth was the softer presence, graceful and serene, always ready with a pie for a church bake sale or a hymn on Sunday morning. Together, they embodied everything. Miller's Creek held sacred hard work, faith, and family. When they announced they were adopting 2 children from out of state, the town rejoiced. Aiden, age 8, and Lily, age 6, arrived in the summer of 2003. There was a welcome party at the church tables, heavy with casseroles and smiles all around. Pastor Hart gave a speech about compassion and community. Ruth cried openly, clutching Lily to her chest, while Daniel stood tall and proud, one hand resting on Aiden's small shoulder. To outsiders, they were the perfect family. But perfect things have a way of hiding cracks beneath the surface. And in Miller's Creek, no one looked too closely. If this story touches your heart, remember to subscribe so you never miss the voices that need to be heard. Morning in Miller's Creek arrived like a hymn, hummed beneath one's breath, soft, orderly, certain of its own goodness. Sunlight lifted itself over the red barns and the long green furrows of pasture. Dew webbed the fence wires like spun glass. At the Whitlock Dairy, the day began before the town. Daniel moved through the pens with the metronomic economy of practiced hands, and Ruth fastened her hair with a quiet pin and whisked the kitchen into brightness. She laid out toast with apple butter, a pitcher of milk, cold enough to miss the glass and the plates that always matched. When the children came down, their clothes were immaculate sleeves creased like folded prayer. Miller's Creek adored this picture. It was the image they had commissioned charity made visible faith put to work a household that could be held up from the pulpit without a single word of caution. At the Sunday potlucks, Ruth stood near the fellowship hall windows receiving compliments with a modest bow of her head. Daniel shook hands that sought him out the way eyes drift to a flag in a light wind. Pastor Hart would set a hand on Daniel's shoulder and say that grace, when tended, becomes a harvest. People nodded as if they'd always known it, and the children moved within this frame like figures in a painting. Aiden was narrow-shouldered and eager to disappear. He watched things more than he joined them. Lily clung to the edges of rooms, to the edges of her own voice, as if sound itself might have teeth. They smiled when called upon to smile. They learned to do it well. If a visitor stood at the Whitlock gate, if a neighbor drove by and lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel in greeting, they would see exactly what they wished to see. It was Nora Bennett who saw something else. She noticed it first in the way Aiden wore his jacket. It was a warm September heat leaning against the school windows, crayons gone wax soft at their tips, but the jacket stayed on. When she asked if he was too warm, he shrugged in a manner that dissolved the question rather than answered it. Lily, in contrast, arranged herself at the back of the classroom, her chair angled so that her spine met the cinder-block wall. She liked corners that shaped themselves around her like parentheses. When the hallway erupted in lockers clanging or laughter sharpened into a sudden spark, Lily's hands floated to her throat and then fell again as if trained to return to stillness. Teachers in small towns learn to love the gentle stories. They tell themselves that quiet children are simply thoughtful, that shyness is a kind of grace. Nora knew these stories, had recited them in her head the way one recites manners, but there was another story beneath this one, and it spoke without permission. It told itself in the faint shadows under Lily's eyes, in the way Aiden counted the seconds between the bell and silence, as if the gap were a chasm. During recess, when the rest of the 4th graders turned the playground into a comet tale of sound and movement, Nora stood near the slide and watched Aiden ease himself onto a swing as if sitting were a fragile agreement he did not wish to break. He did not pump his legs. The chains barely creaked. He stared past the swing set, past the neighbor's maple, toward the thin, wavering strip of pines that marked the edge of town. It was a gaze that did not ask to be returned. When Nora approached, he lowered his eyes to the bark chips at his feet. She asked if he liked the swings. He nodded once in the negative. The answer surprised her more than words would have. The school year unspooled and the town decorated itself for autumn the way a choir lifts harmony to a familiar melody. The first cold nipped through the fields. Breaths turned visible. Church bulletins filled with dates, bake sales, hay rides, mission drives. The Whitlocks' names appeared often always in connection with giving. Daniel donated lumber for the youth room renovation. Ruth organized a casserole chain for a family with a new baby and left a bouquet on the mother's porch unsigned. This is how you become untouchable in a place like Miller's Creek, by placing so many gentle bricks of goodness between your house and the road that few remember how to walk the path in with clear eyes. At parent-teacher conferences, Ruth arrived alone, coat buttoned to her throat, a notebook small enough to disappear into her palm. She listened in a poised quiet that made Nora acutely aware of her own breathing. Nora spoke about reading levels and math fluency, about Aiden's careful handwriting and Lily's perfect attendance. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and the factory-clean scent of new paper. Every time Nora approached the subject of participation, Ruth nodded with luminous patience and said the same phrase syllables aligned like beads on a string. They are easily overwhelmed. We are working on it. Nora recognized the tone. It was the tone of someone closing a door with a smile. Once as the meeting ended, Ruth paused at the threshold, not turning her head, only letting her voice linger a moment behind her like a scarf in a slow wind. "Children come to us with their storms," she said. "Sometimes the holiest task is to quiet the thunder." The sentence was gentle and polished, but its center felt cold. Nora found herself nodding despite the chill. On a Friday in October, the school hosted its harvest fair, and Miller's Creek came out in cords and flannel cheeks already pinked by the promise of winter. Strings of amber bulbs swung from the gym rafters, the hallways filled with the cinnamon-flecked air of cider and candied apples. Children crowned themselves with paper leaves and ran in bright loops. Nora set up the ring toss beside the art display and tried to let the evening carry her along. It almost did. The hum of easy joy is a smooth kind of water. One can drift on it and forget the rocks below. The pop when it came was not even loud, a balloon somewhere losing its patience with the world. But the sound bit the air cleanly, and Lily folded. It happened without spectacle, a kneeling of the body, arms lifted as if to block a rain. No one could feel breath notched into two small spaces. Nora reached her in 3 quick steps. The girl's lips moved in a pattern, barely mouthed syllables caught and released like minnows. The words did not resolve. They did not need to. Panic has its own language. Nora placed her hand lightly on Lily's shoulder and felt a tremor delicate as a trapped wing. Ruth materialized. She always seemed to materialize, hands already smoothing hair, voice conjuring a hush. She drew Lily to her with a practiced grace, and the tremor began to fade. Apologies were offered to the air, to the crowd, to Nora. "Sometimes the noise brings back old weather," Ruth said. The sentence was kind and vague, which is the most useful form of kindness when specificity might reveal a seam. People drifted away, relieved to have resumed their evening. A teacher at the raffle table said it had been a long week, that some children carry nerves like glass. Nora nodded, because nodding can be a kind of survival. But after the lights dimmed and the gym emptied, she sat in her classroom a while and did what she always did on nights when the facts were not enough. She wrote. In a notebook with a soft-spined cover, she set down the small truths: Aiden's jacket, Lily's chair angled to the wall, the sound the balloon made and the way it turned the gym smaller. She did not use the word proof. She used the word pattern. And under it she wrote, "If there is a storm, why does no one feel the wind?" Miller's Creek slept easily that weekend. The paper ran a column about the successful fair, noting the Whitlocks' donation of milk for the cocoa station. In church, the hymn swelled, and Pastor Hart spoke of perseverance as if it were a porch light left on for the weary. He held up Ruth's casserole list as evidence that love is not a feeling, but a practice. Congregants smiled with the proud comfort of having chosen the right heroes. Nora did not attend that Sunday. She walked the perimeter of the elementary school instead, the sky a dull pewter, resting on the roof lines, the playground bare as a stage after the curtain. She stood at the edge of the blacktop and listened for echoes that were not there. On Monday, she would call the nurse's office to ask a question she had not yet learned how to form. On Monday, she would sit at her desk and watch Aiden's pencil travel the ruled page like a narrow stream, and try to decide if courage too was a practice, something one performs imperfectly until the hand knows the motion by heart. Some stories present themselves as thunder. Others arrive as a whisper threaded through ordinary days. Miller's Creek preferred thunder. It made for better photographs. But a whisper, when left to coil upon itself, can tighten into a knot no one wants to cut. If this chapter has found a quiet place in you, consider subscribing, so these voices, faint, persistent, and worth hearing, will always have a way to reach you. The Monday after the harvest fair dawned in shades of muted gray, the sky pressed low as if the earth itself wanted silence. Children filed into Miller's Creek Elementary beneath the weight of backpacks and weekend stories, their laughter thinner than usual, washed pale by the rain that had fallen overnight. Nora Bennett stood at her classroom door, greeting each student with the same steady smile, her voice a soft ribbon threading through the morning chaos. When Aiden and Lily stepped through the threshold, they seemed carved from a different weather entirely. Lily's eyes were shadowed not by sleep alone, but by something deeper, a kind of interior night that refused to lift. She moved to her usual place in the back corner chair, angled toward the wall, hands folded neatly on her desk as if presenting proof of her own invisibility. Aiden trailed behind, her jacket zipped to the collar. Despite the unseasonable warmth, his face arranged into an expression so careful it seemed rehearsed. The fair had been a celebration for everyone else. For these two children, it had been a fracture point. Nora felt the echo of that moment every time she looked at them. She tried to imagine what Lily had heard in that single balloon pop. Perhaps it wasn't the sound itself, but what it summoned the memory of something darker. A thunder that existed only for her. During recess, Nora lingered near the windows while the other teachers chatted about grading deadlines and lesson plans. She watched Aiden move across the playground, a solitary figure threading through groups of running, shouting children. He didn't join their games. He didn't even look at them. Instead, he paced the perimeter, tracing the fence line as if measuring the distance between this world and another. When he passed a group of boys kicking a ball, they called to him once, twice, then gave up their laughter, bending away like reeds before the wind. Lily didn't appear on the playground at all. Nora found her in the library, sitting in a small pool of sunlight near the biographies. She held a book in her lap, but wasn't reading. Her gaze was fixed on the door as if expecting someone or fearing them. Nora crouched beside her, speaking softly. Lily started, then covered her reaction with a practiced stillness. "Do you like this book?" Nora asked, though the words felt hollow. Lily nodded, the movement almost imperceptible. She didn't speak. Nora didn't press. Some silences are fortresses. Breaching them too quickly only drives the inhabitants deeper inside. That evening, Nora stayed late at school. The halls emptied. The janitor's vacuum droned in the distance, and the smell of disinfectant hung faintly in the air. She sat at her desk with her notebook open, trying to capture what she had seen and felt. She wrote of Pattern's Lily's collapse, Aiden's retreat, the way both children carried themselves like shadows afraid of the light. She didn't use the word abuse. That word was too sharp, too heavy. Instead, she wrote storm. It was safer that way, less likely to tear the page. The following morning, Linda Park, the school nurse, knocked on Nora's classroom door. Her expression was tight, her clipboard clutched like a shield. "Can I speak with you privately?" she asked. They stepped into the hallway where the air smelled faintly of crayons and bleach. Linda's voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "Aiden came to see me this morning," she said. "He said he fell from a tree and hurt his arm. That's what he claimed anyway. But when I examined him—" She hesitated, her eyes scanning the hallway as if words themselves could draw danger. The marks weren't from a fall. They were too symmetrical. Both wrists, same pattern. It looked like something had been pressing there for a long time. Nora's stomach tightened. "Like restraints?" she asked. Linda gave a single, grave nod. Not raw, not new, healed over but still visible, old and deliberate. The hallway seemed to narrow around them. Nora felt the weight of those words settle like stones in her chest. "What are you going to do?" she whispered. "I documented everything in my log," Linda replied. "But you know how this town is. Without fresh injury, without a direct accusation." Her voice trailed off. The unspoken truth hovered between them. Miller's Creek protected its own, and the Whitlocks were more than protected. They were revered. Nora returned to her classroom, her mind churning. When the final bell rang and the children scattered, she sat alone at her desk staring at the wall where Lily had spent the day. The paint there was slightly darker, worn smooth by years of chairs rubbing against it. She imagined Lily's small back against that wall, her body bracing against a storm no one else could feel. Nora opened her notebook and wrote one sentence, pressing hard enough to tear the paper. "If there is harm, it is hidden in plain sight." Meanwhile, outside the school, the town spun its own narrative. Parents discussed the fair's success over coffee at the diner. The local paper ran a glowing column praising Ruth Whitlock's tireless volunteer work and Daniel's donation of firewood to the church. Pastor Hart preached about the sanctity of family, his voice warm and certain. Each compliment, each public gesture was another brick in the wall surrounding the Whitlocks' image. That wall was not built of lies, but of good deeds which are harder to question. The contrast gnawed at Nora. She walked through town on Saturday morning and saw only smiles, neighbors exchanging greetings, the church bell tolling. On the surface, Miller's Creek was a painting of harmony. But paintings can conceal what the canvas beneath endures. As she passed the general store, she overheard two women speaking about the Whitlocks. Their words were full of admiration. Ruth's pies, Daniel's work ethic, how blessed the children must be to have found such a home. Nora wanted to interrupt to tell them what she had seen, but her tongue stayed still. Without proof, her fears would sound like blasphemy. That night she dreamed of the balloon pop at the fair. In her dream, the sound echoed endlessly, stretching into something larger and darker. When she woke, her pulse was a drumbeat against her ribs. She sat up and wrote by lamplight, scribbling through the remnants of sleep. She wrote of the pattern again and of the silence surrounding it. Silence, she realized, was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of many voices choosing not to speak. Sunday came. Nora attended church for the first time in weeks, needing to see with her own eyes the community she felt slipping away from her. The sanctuary glowed with stained glass and hymn light. Pastor Hart's sermon was about mercy, about how sometimes the greatest love is quiet and unseen. His words flowed over the congregation like warm water. When he spoke of Ruth Whitlock's generosity, a murmur of approval rippled through the pews. Nora looked around and saw nothing but devotion. She felt like a single discordant note in a flawless chord. It frightened her more than she cared to admit. If harm was occurring, it was not only hidden in the Whitlock home, but protected by the town's refusal to imagine it. When the final hymn ended, people filed out in pairs and clusters, their voices weaving together like threads. Nora walked alone, her steps echoing against the wooden floor. Outside, the sky was cloudless, unnaturally bright. She squinted against the glare, against the illusion of clarity. She knew now that the storm she sensed would not announce itself with thunder. It would whisper, it would wait, and if no one listened, it would grow. If you're following this story, remember to subscribe so these whispers will always find someone willing to hear them. Nora chose a Monday afternoon when the sky flattened into pewter and the wind moved like a quiet warning through the maples along Main Street. She carried her notebook inside her shoulder bag as if it were a small and fragile animal, and walked to the red Cedar County Sheriff's Office with the deliberate calm of someone stepping across thin ice. The lobby smelled faintly of old paper and coffee left too long on a hot plate. Fluorescent lights hummed above a row of metal chairs, their legs scuffed into pale half-moons on the linoleum. Sheriff Samuel Cortez met her with the worn steadiness of a man who had learned to listen before he decided to speak. His office held the domesticated clutter of a life spent in the business of other people's worst days. case folders stacked by the window, a corkboard annotated by colored pins, a chipped mug with the sheriff's star fading back into ceramic. Nora sat opposite him and placed her notebook on the desk as if returning a borrowed truth. She did not flood the room with claims. She offered him a sequence, the jacket that never came off the chair angled to the wall, the balloon, the collapse, the murmur that sounded like a prayer taught by fear, then the nurse's notes, 2 wrists, the symmetry of pressure, the way healed skin keeps a memory even when everyone insists on forgetting. Cortez listened without interrupting. He took notes the way a careful man stacks firewood a piece at a time, each aligned for use later. When she finished, a hush settled, not empty but dense with the weight of what had been placed between them. He said he would look. It was not a promise dressed in velvet words. It was a simple hinge on which the next days would turn. He began with the kind of visit that wears no badge but authority, a drive out to the Whitlock farm at the haloed edge of Miller's Creek, where fences sit white and straight against pasture. The house, as always, was immaculate. Lemon polish and something faintly sweet slipped along the hallways. Ruth stood poised by the kitchen doorway, hands folded as if to hold the air still. Daniel joined them with the forthright comfort of a man surrounded by the evidence of his own goodness. Cortez asked humane questions, the kind that arrive like neighbors. How are the children? How is the season? How has the weather treated the herd? The rhythm lulled like a hymn. Only when the melody had grown familiar did he ask to see the downstairs. The refusal came soft and instantaneous, the way a flame withdraws from a sudden breath. Daniel's jaw eased into a firm line. Ruth's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly at her waist. The word no did not rise. It settled. Cortez did not challenge it. He absorbed the small change in temperature, the sudden stillness of a house that did not want to be fully seen, and he thanked them for their time. Back at his desk, he wrote the note with the economy of a man who knows which details matter. Refused basement. Shift in demeanor. He began to gather strands. Receipts first, because paper does not learn to lie as quickly as people do. He followed the quiet trail out of county across a border of cornfields into a hardware store where the bell above the door rang with the dry cheer of habit. The owner, Miles Keegan, kept memory the way careful men keep ledgers. Yes, he remembered the big purchase earlier in the year. Chained by the yard, a pair of industrial padlocks, a reinforced hinge set paid in cash but with a phone number written to collect a discount. When Cortez slid a photo across the counter, the answer arrived without theater. "That's the man." He added another note. He kept the tone steady when he called ADA Claire Donnelly, who understood the arithmetic of probable cause like a second language. They spoke in the measured cadence of professionals who know that haste is the enemy of durable truth. Claire requested photographs of the nurse's documentation. She would need an expert opinion, even unofficial, to translate marks into meaning. Cortez asked the medical examiner's office to look at the images informally, quietly. The reply returned with the evening consistent with prolonged restraint, bilateral, not self-inflicted, not accidental. A conclusion without hyperbole. It sat in his file like a stone. Miller's Creek, meanwhile, performed the self-defense of small towns when someone rearranges their favorite picture. Pastor Hart preached a sermon about bearing false witness, not naming names, but laying a garment of caution over the pews. Heads nodded. Ruth's casserole lists multiplied. Daniel stacked split wood outside the church youth room. Nora felt the temperature of conversations change when she entered a room. Compliments for her bulletin board displays found her like polite birds. The other things did not. A custodian said quietly that certain doors are meant to stay closed. A school board member wondered aloud whether city teachers brought city problems in their pockets. The wall around the Whitlocks did not grow taller. It grew kinder, which is harder to climb. A man who delivered feed to the farm came by the station at dusk, hands restless in the brim of his cap. He said he sometimes heard something like knocking when he set bags by the cellar bulkhead, not loud, just there. He did not sign a statement. He came back 2 days later to say he must have been mistaken. His eyes avoided Cortez's, as if truth were light he could not afford. All of this threaded itself into the sheriff's days like a color that refuses to stay hidden in fabric. He drove the long roads in the blue hours and let the mind's map overlay the land, the payphone by the abandoned station. The recall of a whisper in a dispatcher's headset, the farmhouse with its scrubbed floors and its single forbidden door. The picture formed not as a shout, but as the accumulation of small insistences. He returned to the Whitlocks a week later under the pretext of routine follow-up. The house was the same, but the silence had changed. It was not the comfortable hush of order, it was the hush of watching. Cortez noticed the Bibles stacked by the parlor chair, the leather worn by use, the margins paced by tiny notes. He noticed Ruth's eyes when he said Lily's name, how they softened and then almost invisibly fixed. He noticed a scuff along the baseboard near the kitchen that the polish had not forgiven. None of these were crimes. Together they formed a question. Paper built the rest. Phone logs, store ledgers, the medical note transcribed with sober care. Claire told him to hold steady. She would prepare the petition, but they would need a judge willing to imagine what the town did not want to see. The petition took shape like a patient's breath after a long walk, thin at first, then stronger until the lungs remembered their work. Nora, in those days, slept in narrow ribbons of rest. She taught as if lesson plans could keep grief at bay, and wrote in the evenings as if ink might convince courage to stay. The nurse kept silent records. Jenna Morales, miles away in the dispatch center, opened her archived file once more and let the whisper move through her again. Help me. New locks. Basement. The words returned like weather. When the judge signed the warrant just after dawn on May 15th, the paper trembled minutely in Cortez's hand, not from fear, but from the body's recognition that a threshold had been reached. He folded the document and slid it into the inner pocket of his jacket, the way a man shelters a match against the wind. The morning smelled of wet pasture and cut hay. In the driveway, Deputy Owen Hale checked the camera batteries. Deputy Brecker locked the trunk on the evidence kits with the neat click of final things. They drove out of town under a sky rinsed clear. The fences along the road held their white as if they could hold also a secret. Ahead, the Whitlock house stood bright as a parable. The sheriff did not quicken his step when he reached the porch. He let the warrant be the only raised voice. Inside, his chest calm gathered itself into purpose. Whatever waited below, he thought, had waited long enough. The morning opened with a deliberate hush, the kind of quiet that does not ask for attention but receives it anyway. Sheriff Samuel Cortez parked at the mouth of the Whitlock driveway, gravel whispering beneath the tires. The air smelled of pasture and a faint metallic tang that arrived before thought like a word on the tip of the tongue. Dew clung to the white fence rails in small congregations of light. Behind them, the Whitlock house held its bright angles as if nothing inside could be bent. Deputies Owen Hale and Brecker moved with the dry, practiced grace of men who have learned to split motion from emotion. One checked the body camera's red eye, the other lifted the evidence kits with careful hands. Cortez slid the warrant from his jacket and felt the paper cool against his palm. He could hear the cows far off a soft living backdrop while closer the wind rehearsed itself in the leaves. When he knocked, the door did not open at once. It considered. Then the latch clicked and gave, and there stood Daniel Whitlock, broad-shouldered and unblinking, wearing the same expression one brings to weather, something to endure, not to fear. Ruth appeared a step behind him. Hair calm. Hands pressed together, a figure framed by lemon-bright floors and the sweetness of something baked into the wood. Cortez did not raise his voice. The warrant spoke for him, a plain page carrying the full weight of what comes next. The living room accepted them, with its polished quiet. Photographs on the wall offered the town's favorite story back to itself: church suppers, a harvest parade, children looking toward the lens with the tidy concentration of being told to smile. Everything gleamed. Everything asked to be believed. He asked the question that mattered, and only that, the door to the basement. The answer from Daniel came not as a word but as a long, considered stillness. Something shifted behind the eyes like a curtain drawn half an inch against a sun that had become intrusive. Ruth's fingers stitched tighter. The pause was part refusal, part farewell, to a season that could not be kept. At last, Daniel gestured a small concession that cost more than it showed. The door waited at the end of a narrow hall, older than the house around it, its wood darkened by years of polish and denial. The brass handle had been coaxed into shine again and again, as if brightness could be its own absolution. Cortez reached for it and felt the temperature change, the cool breath rising from below the air, threaded with the flat, clean note of disinfectant and something else at the edge of knowing. The key turned. Hinges voiced a quiet history. The first step sighed beneath his weight, and then the next, until the house narrowed to a spine of stairs and a beam of light he held in his hand. The deputies followed each footfall measured. With every descent, the scent sharpened an unwelcome duet of bleach and the iron of old air. Pipes ran along the wall like veins. Concrete gathered the light and gave back only what it must. At the bottom, the hallway split the earth into a short corridor, ending in a door that did not belong to a family home. Its face was heavy, the edges banded with hardware that looked purposeful rather than decorative. Along the knob, faint scratches radiated in soft arcs, the language of insistence written where no one was meant to read. Cortez lifted the flashlight and let the beam move slow, deliberate like a hand learning a face in the dark. Deputy Hale documented each detail, the camera's quiet blink assigning memory to the moment. Brecker worked the bolts. They did not leap free. They surrendered in small, reluctant increments as if time itself had fused them to duty. When the last slid back, the room opened with the sound of a held breath releasing. Silence held court inside. Not the ordinary silence of a room between uses, but a dressed silence, layered, padded, coaxed into obedience. The walls wore soundproofing in dull gray squares, some blotched faintly by the history of touch. 2 narrow beds sat in opposite corners, their iron frames honest about their function. At each bed's corners, rings waited where blankets should have been persuasive enough. On the floor, coiled lengths of chain lay like punctuation at the end of sentences no child should be asked to finish. In the center, a small table had arranged itself into meaning a Bible, with underscored passages soft from fingers, a lined notebook open to a familiar hand, and a folded belt whose surface had learned too much about edges. Cortez did not need to touch anything to understand everything. He stood still and let the room complete its sentence inside him. On the walls, this was the part that altered breath paper had been taped in tender crooked rows. Children's drawings, their corners softened by time and their colors stubborn against the gray. Houses with precise windows. Fields under obliging suns. Stick figures with bands darkly drawn at wrists and ankles like bracelets that would not come off. In one, a square filled most of the page, a room inside a room, and within it 2 small figures held hands while a larger figure hovered at the margin without a face. In another, a bird sketched mid-flight, its wings arrestingly open, but above it a line of what might have been sky drawn as a thick bar. The signatures at the bottom came tentative and small. Aiden. Lily. Deputy Hale's camera found each page. The lens did not tremble. The man behind it swallowed once and went on. Cortez spoke only enough to summon the work call, the forensic team, seal the space document, the path in and out. There was no satisfaction to be had, no triumph. What lay before them was not a solved riddle, but a revealed wound. He thought without deciding to think it of Jenna Morales at a desk in a room of humming lights, a child's whisper moving through static like a moth through rain. Help me. New locks. Basement. The words reached across time and set themselves down precisely where he stood. Upstairs, the house had shifted without moving. Ruth sat on the sofa with her hands folded as if in prayer, her face composed in a still water that reflected nothing. Daniel stood near the window, shoulders squared, jaw set, eyes steady, not with innocence, but with a conviction that believes itself a kind of light. Cortez could feel the deputies behind him, the air of a room in which the truth has entered, but the participants have not yet welcomed it. He read the rites with the same even cadence he used for the weather. There would be statements later, and a courtroom with wood polished by generations of hands and attorneys who could turn sentences into bridges or traps. In this moment, only the simple gravity of removal mattered. Handcuffs clicked with the ordinary sound of a task performed correctly. The cuffs were not retribution, they were a boundary newly drawn. As Daniel was led past him, the man's gaze flicked to the hallway as if measuring the distance between his own certainty and the law's insistence. Ruth rose without argument, her composure intact but emptied of destination. Cortez held the door for them because courtesy is a discipline that does not depend on its recipient. Outside, the morning had grown brighter. It felt almost rude in its generosity. The forensic team arrived with its quiet theater of boxes and labeled bags with camera flashes like small, careful lightning. They would lift hair and fibers and the invisible dust of touch. They would trace DNA where memory had been told not to speak. The house, which had for years presented a single story without seams, would be asked at last to admit its chapters. When the last photograph had been taken and the door below had been closed and sealed, Cortez walked the length of the hallway alone. He paused at the frame of a picture near the stairs, Daniel and Ruth in their Sunday-best 2 children at their sides, all of them arranged before a backdrop of autumn leaves. It was a perfect image, and that was the problem. Perfection is so often a pose held just beyond the tremor. He thought of Nora writing the word pattern in a notebook of Linda's clipboard with its quiet facts of a community that loved its reflection enough to be careless with what the mirror could not show. On the porch, the light widened. The deputies loaded the evidence kits, each box a small argument against forgetting. Across the fields, a hawk circled an uncomplicated circle traced against a blue that had decided to be flawless. Cortez closed his eyes and opened them again. Work remained. There would be reports and affidavits and a chain of custody to tend like a live flame. But for a beat, he let himself feel the shift. The door below had been opened. Air moved where it had not moved for too long. Somewhere in town a teacher would sleep, if not easily, then less alone. Somewhere at a dispatch desk a file name would feel less like an accusation and more like a promise kept. He stepped down onto the path. Gravel whispered again this time, like relief learning how to speak. The courthouse was not built for spectacle. Its wood-paneled walls and brass fixtures spoke of quieter decades when justice moved at a slower pace and the people who sought it carried more faith than fear. But on the first day of the Whitlock trial, every inch of the old building seemed to vibrate beneath the weight of eyes and breath. The pews overflowed with townsfolk who had once brought pies to Ruth's bake sales, who had once raised their hands in prayer beside Daniel. Now they sat shoulder to shoulder, their silence pressed flat by disbelief. Reporters crowded the back rows, their pens poised like small, eager knives. Cameras waited just beyond the steps outside their lenses, hungry for a glimpse of something that had been hidden too long. Inside, Sheriff Samuel Cortez sat near the aisle, his uniform pressed but his face worn as though sleep had been an infrequent visitor these last weeks. Nora Bennett sat 2 rows behind him, her hands folded around a small notebook she no longer dared to write in. Linda Park sat at the edge of the same row, eyes downcast as if the floorboards might offer absolution. The trial opened without flourish. The prosecutor, ADA Claire Donnelly, laid out the case with a steady, clinical hand. She spoke not of monsters or saints, but of facts. The photographs of the room below the chains, the rings set into bed frames, the drawings signed with children's names. Each exhibit was presented as if the truth were a fragile object too important to be dropped. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. The defense attorney countered with an argument that sounded almost like scripture. Discipline, he said, could be misinterpreted. Faith was a private thing. Trauma might rewrite memory. The Whitlocks, he insisted, had acted from love, from a belief, however strict, that order was salvation. Some jurors shifted in their seats. It was an argument designed to make hesitation feel like reason. Then came the testimony. Nora was called first. She rose with the hesitant dignity of someone stepping forward into light after too many days underground. Her words were careful, recounting the moments she had witnessed the balloon pop at the fair Lily's collapse, the whispering repetitions of, "Don't lock me up." She described Aiden's jacket, Lily's chosen corner, the pattern she had seen and named in secret. Her voice broke only once when she spoke of Lily's eyes. There was knowing in them, she said softly, the kind that children shouldn't have. The courtroom listened hushed to the fracture in her tone. Linda followed. She presented the medical records without embellishment, the symmetrical markings on Aiden's wrists projected on a screen for the jury. The images were clinical, yet they drew a collective breath from the room, the sound of a community being forced to see what it had chosen not to. Linda's voice did not waver. These were not caused by a fall, she said. They were caused by prolonged restraint. Weeks, possibly months. One by one, the pieces of the puzzle were set on the table, the store receipt for chains and locks verified by Miles Keegan, the photographs of the soundproofed room, the recordings of Jenna Morales' 911 call from that night months before. Jenna herself did not testify in person, but her voice played through the speakers. The child's whisper thin, deliberate afraid filled the room. "Help me. Dad put new locks. Basement." For a moment, even the defense attorney lowered his gaze, and then Lily. She entered the courtroom like someone stepping from shadow into unkind light. Now 15, she wore a plain blue dress provided by her foster guardians. Her hair was neatly brushed, her shoes scuffed by hallways not yet familiar. She sat in the witness chair and gripped its arms, her knuckles white. The room leaned toward her, not in hunger, but in fragile, aching hope. The judge's voice was soft when he asked if she was ready. Lily nodded once. Her testimony was not a flood. It was a series of small stones placed carefully in a line, each one carrying weight beyond its size. She spoke of the room below, of the way silence had been enforced, like prayer, of the stories Daniel told about sin and salvation. They said the chains were like Jesus' suffering. She said her voice a bare thread. They said if I spoke, God would take my soul. The words landed like a blow. Somewhere in the back row, a woman wept into her hands. Lily lifted her head then, and for the first time she looked directly at Daniel and Ruth. "But I'm speaking now," she said, "and my soul is still mine." A hush deeper than any sermon settled over the courtroom. Even the air seemed to pause. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours. When they returned, their faces were pale, their verdicts sharp and unanimous, guilty on all counts. Daniel was sentenced to 40 years without parole. Ruth received 25. Neither spoke. Neither wept. They left the courtroom, flanked by deputies, their silhouettes receding like a dream finally admitted as nightmare. After the trial, the town moved with the stunned carefulness of a body learning to walk after injury. The Whitlock farm was stripped of its myth. Grass grew wild where neat paths had been kept. Windows shattered in storms and were not replaced. Eventually, the county ordered the house demolished. Concrete was poured into the hollow where the basement had been sealing its history beneath earth and stone. On that same land, a new building rose, the Millers Creek Family Advocacy Center. Its walls were painted in warm colors, its rooms filled with light. Above the door, in brass letters, was inscribed a single sentence: "Listen even when no one is speaking." Aiden and Lily disappeared into the protection program. Their names changed their past lives, folded away like fragile paper. Aiden found solace working with animals, his hands gentle, his presence quiet. Lily began to draw again, not cages or chains, but clouds and birds, and once a river with no end. She spoke little of the past, but when she did, her words were deliberate, like stones set in place to build a new foundation. Nora continued teaching, but her role shifted. She helped create a district-wide initiative on trauma awareness, training teachers to see what they had once been taught to ignore. At the first workshop, she said only this: "Some storms whisper. If we do not listen, they will grow." Sheriff Cortez retired 6 months later. On his last day, he left a folder labeled "Warning Signs" on the desk of his successor. Inside were notes from the case written in his precise hand. At the bottom of the last page he had written, If someone whispers, listen. If someone stares too long. ESB. Years later, a letter arrived at the courthouse. No return address, no signature, just a single sheet of plain paper bearing 4 words. Thank you for listening. It was signed with 2 initials, A and L. The letter was framed and placed in the lobby of the Family Advocacy Center. Visitors passed it without always reading, but those who did felt something stir in the quiet between lines. On a spring morning, long after the trial had faded from headlines, a woman walked past the new center. She paused to watch a pair of birds lift into the sky, their wings cutting clean arcs above the rebuilt land. Somewhere in a place known only to them, Aiden and Lily walked free, the wind a friend instead of a threat, and though their voices might never reach the town again, the echo of their survival remained a whisper strong enough to change the world.